Hi, welcome back to another Basement Bible Breakdown, the three BBs. Tonight, I want to take a little bit of time to explain to you where I came up with the idea of Middleism. And of course, if you've been around and seen any of these videos, you know that I'm talking and I keep bringing up Middleism. So what is it exactly that I'm communicating by that? And yes, I created that tongue-in-cheek. It was not meant to start some kind of new eschatology title or anything else like that. It was simply because when I started discussions with people, they all wanted to accuse me and say I was partial preterist. Well, partial preterist, of course, accepts the early date and then tries to mix the Olivet with the Revelation and try to figure out what came soon, what came later, what's fulfilled, what's not fulfilled, and of course you have 1,000 varying opinions about that. So simply, I outlined my case very distinctly so that people can understand exactly where I'm coming from. Now, as I've mentioned before, in one sense, I am the classic historical post-trib pre-mill second return of Christ position, just like in much of the early church fathers, and we discussed that before. So now, in clarifying and separating yourself from the dispensationalist, because most preterists want to argue with you from a dispensational viewpoint, and I kind of blow their minds when I sit there and tell them that the Olivet has been completely fulfilled. Everything in it was fulfilled by 70 AD. And part of the context that I picked that up from is simply this: not one stone will be left upon another, and it'll come upon this generation. I have seen no exegetical evidence, get that word out right here, where we divide up the Olivet into a future or in a past, like partial do, or dispensationalists that basically put it all future and say it's all about the second coming, or preterists, of course, it's all past. And maybe that might be the only thing that I agree with full preterists, is that the Olivet is completely fulfilled. But here's the clarifier that I've already talked about. It has no promise in it of a second coming. The coming of a second coming. Yeah, we got that out right now. The phrase "Son of Man coming on clouds" comes from the Old Testament, as we talked about, Daniel 7, 13 and 14. And so when it says Jesus is coming into his kingdom, coming in his kingdom, or coming into the glory of his kingdom, or anything like that, it is picking up from Daniel 7, where it is Christ who is ascending and coming into his throne, sitting down, and because he sits down, he has the right to judge. He is now the one who sends judgment on Israel for their rejection of him. So with that in mind, there's a couple of the key points that I want to bring out. The first thing is that also with Middleism, I believe in the late date of Revelation. Now, people sit there and well, have you read Gentry? Have you done this? And yes, I've read Gentry, Robinson's. I've scrutinized every one of them. And let me give you a brief take on some things here that I've noticed by them. Of course, Gentry breaks it up by internal and external arguments. For the record, anything on the internal is based on subjective interpretations, and for any one interpretation that they might provide, a partial preterist or even a full preterist concerning those things, there's always 3 or 4 other valid interpretations that seem right to people. But what makes something actually valid, of course, is whether it creates consistency and harmony with the rest of the scriptures, and in most cases it does not. So when we talk about Gentry's thing, of course, internal is a whole different thing. The external, when we look at all the examples and all the things that he examined, the reality is there's not one statement clear cut as what we find in Irenaeus or in Clement or even in Eusebius, any church father that actually comes out and sits there and says that, hey, the date of Revelations and John was on the island of Patmos during the time of Nero, or any other such statements. There is none. The only statements that we've got is simply this, is Irenaeus' quote, what was seen? Was it the Revelation or was it John that was being seen? And that is what people question. That is where, quote unquote, the problem is. And the rest of Gentrys' arguments, of course, is to point out that Eusebius and Irenaeus or Clement or anybody else are not perfect in all their theologies and doctrines and things like that. We know that. There is no such thing as anybody perfect outside of the apostles and what they wrote in inspiration. Nobody's going to be perfect in all the things. But when you've got 4 or 5 people all saying the same thing about the same event in history, then we have to buckle up and say, okay, that's probably true, where there are 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, the thing to point out, of course, is in Gentrys' book with the Irenaeus quote, what he fails to actually deal with and mention any kind of substantive way that Irenaeus talked about seeing John during the time of Domitian or during the time of Trajan. He says it twice earlier, and it's just very brief statements, that John was seen up until the time of Trajan, and possibly that he wrote during the time of or after he was released from the island from Domitian. And so people want to go back, well, that's the family name of Nero, it's Domitian, and it goes on and on with those kind of arguments back and forth. But it never negates the fact that he already established that John was seen alive and lived up to the time of Trajan. Eusebius records that whenever a Caesar died, when he banished people or made those kind of things, the Senate would always go back and look over those things and send people back. They would be released from being sent to the island. So that is why we say that John was on the island. When he wrote the Revelation out, actually, he saw it while he was on the island, but he wrote it after he had been released from the island. And so the clear-cut thing that we have is from Eusebius is that after Domitian died, John was released and came back from the island of Patmos. That is the statements that are being, and it would seem that Clement agrees to the same thing. So, of course, Gentrys' goal is to prove that wrong, and you're trying to prove that statement wrong by showing that, hey, he had made other mistakes. Okay, yeah, we all do. We've already talked about that. So, I don't think when we go to that quote, grammatically, we can sit there and say it was John, and at questioning whether it was John that was saying, because he's already established that. That's the strongest argument for that quote being about. It was the revelation that was being seen. Now, concerning full preterists who try to use that, there's something that I think that goes out the window, is that in that whole book, in the passages and chapters of Irenaeus, what he is sitting there actually talking about is the Antichrist and his coming and all that. And people do not realize, maybe pick it up, that he is talking about it all being future. Not once did Irenaeus, who wrote about 150, did he ever say that this was past, that the fulfillment of the revelation was past. He never brought that up. He said all the things have yet to be fulfilled and is in our future, as did all early church fathers talk about the fulfillment of the second coming and those things. They were all future still. So when we also go back and we look at the dates that they try to propose, that is before AD 70, let's look at a couple of problems here. And the first one is that you want to claim that Nero is the beast, or might have been the beast. And here's maybe the biggest problem. It says that when Jesus comes back in 2 Thessalonians 8, that when Jesus comes back, he reveals who the beast is and exposes him for the fake that he is. Then why are we still questioning who the beast is today if he should have been revealed, if he should have been known? That's one question. But the second question is that it says that by the coming and his appearing, he will kill the beast. When we go to Revelations 19:19, what happens? When Jesus returns, it says he takes the beast and the false prophet and throws them alive into the lake of fire. That is not figurative, symbolic language or anything else. That is literal. You've got two people here that have been deceiving the nations, who are the kings of an empire, of a kingdom, a false prophet who has been doing signs and wonders and getting people to believe that the beast is God and so forth. And And then the language of Revelation 20, or even of 19, it says, these two were thrown alive into the lake of fire. And it refers to them as people, as men, as individuals, not things, its, theys, or anything else. So these two are thrown into the lake of fire alive. Well, hopefully you can catch on that thing. If Nero was the beast and he was supposed to have been thrown alive into the lake of fire in 70 AD, that would be an impossibility because he committed suicide in 68 by his own hand. He wasn't killed by Christ, who was returning and threw him into the lake of fire alive. He was killed by his own hand. So that rules out Nero automatically. And trying to go back and figure out who was the fifth king of the eighth and whatever else doesn't work because scriptures do not contradict. So you can't say he was the one that was and that he is the beast. It just doesn't work. Secondly, about the timing, 68. Most of early proponents are sitting there saying it was written about 68 because, of course, John would have been released from the island and would have been back there and been able to write, make copies of the book, distribute. Oh, wait, you have a problem there. He comes back, he's got to write it all out, make copies, and then distribute it to the 7 churches in 68. Does anybody catch what's wrong with that? The beast rules for 42 months, and he's killed in the 70. Subtract 42 months from 70, you get 66 and a half. The events of Revelation have to happen at the earliest, before 66. They have to start before 66. So why is it that John would sit there and get a revelation in 68, come back, write the whole thing out and everything else, and distribute and say, hey, these are things that are going to soon take place. And they're already half over, or a year and a half into everything, and you're going to sit there and tell me that that's logical, that this is a prophecy about what is to soon happen, but yet it's already a year and a half over. So I think some people recognize you can't do that. You can't blame it on Nero. And if people remember right, that Nero started his reign in the early 50s, 52, 53, I believe it was, or something like that, not 42 months. He wasn't given power by the kings, by 10 kings for 42 months during that time either. That's kind of simply ridiculous. And then we also have to understand the persecution of Christians. John would have never been said before 64. Why? Well, real persecution of Christians by the government, Caesar, did not happen until then. And that was only simply because Nero burnt down Rome and blamed it on the Christians. So persecution at that point became full on. And of course, it's later we're talking about it was Nero who was setting Christians on fire and in the city to light the roads up and by putting them on stakes. All kinds of reports. And then later on, Christians, Polycarp and the others, were fed to the lions in the thing. Even Paul, was sent and beheaded at the in a public square for everybody to see. But the idea is that the persecution, of course, could not have started before then. Now, why did the real persecution even start and begin with? And that's because the common greeting back in Roman days, of course, is when you met each other was Hail Caesar. Where do you think Hitler got it from? Hail Hitler, Hail Caesar. It's the same thing. It's where he stole that from. You had Heil Caesar. And the other form of the greeting was Caesar is Lord. Heil Hitler, Caesar is Lord. And that is what the Christians refused to do. So how could you identify Christians? They would not use that phraseology. It was Paul who would sit there and argue in his books who said that, no, Caesar is not Lord. It is Jesus who is Lord. He is the one that is the true Lord and over everything. So that is one of that's dating the early, the early dating. My arguments for the early dating, a good part of it. And trust me, I've read everything you can bring up. I pretty much have read it. I've read all the church fathers on that. I've covered it over pretty good. So now the other major distinction for Middleism, and I'm working on my master's in theology right now. I'm working on my master's thesis. And what it involves is those three things that I have talked about. Why I reject preterism and why I reject dispensationalism. And it has to do with always the late date, and the Olivet has nothing to do with Revelations. They cannot be combined and say there's partial fulfillment of the Olivet in Revelations. The two of them are completely two different settings. They have one has nothing to do with the other. Now, I see my time is up, so what I will do is close this out, and I will come back and finish this up later. Thank you. You have a good night.